Welcome to the Northeast Kingdom Voice. I'm your host, Scott Wheeler. On September 26, the city of Newport will recognize the 100th year since the death of its only police officer to be killed in the line of duty. Today's guest is Chief Cheif DiSanto. He will be talking about the fallen officer, as well as plans to recognize him. And welcome to the show, Chief DiSanto.
Thank you, Scott.
So, 100 years. I wrote about it extensively back a few years ago, but I guess I wouldn't have thought, it wouldn't have clicked that this is 100 years.
Yep.
Now, am I right? That's the only officer in Newport to ever, at least to be killed in the line of duty.
That is correct.
What about die in the line of duty? Do you know if that's, a heart attack or anything?
No, to my knowledge, he's the only officer to die in the line of duty.
Right. So what are you planning?
Right now we're in the planning phases, but we have a small memorial service that we're planning. I've contacted the governor's office about getting permission from the governor to fly the flag in front of the police department at half-staff for the day. We're going to have an honor guard from Border Patrol and law enforcement representatives from the Sheriff's Department, Vermont State Police, Vermont Fish and Wildlife, Border Patrol, and Customs to do a small memorial ceremony out in front of the police department. Border Patrol is going to provide an honor guard for that detail, and we'll have a small reception afterwards.
And here is a photo of Patrolman Joseph Montague. Is that the way we pronounce his name?
I do, yeah. Joseph Montague.
Right. So I had the privilege of actually meeting his descendants back a few years ago because I called up Chief Duquette, former Chief Duquette, and because I was looking for a photo of him, and the chief said, well, I'm looking for one too, so we kind of partnered on this, and we wanted to recognize him by putting a face to him, and so I wrote a series of articles, and lo and behold, after we found the photo, and then at the same time, the great-great-grandson, I believe it was in California, I might be wrong, Bridge Kearney was doing a little bit of genealogical research, and he stumbled onto one of my articles, and the family was totally amazed as his father was still alive at the time, which would be the grandson of the fallen officer, and they had no idea. They knew he'd died, but they had no idea that he'd been killed in the line of duty. So they came over, and they visited with Chief Duquette and went to the site where he was killed. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of an honor. So, are you going to reach out to the family again?
Those are my plans, yeah, to reach out and invite them to the ceremony.
Right. I don't know how many are left. So here's the photo of where he was actually killed. That was the Newport House Hotel, and that stood where People's Bank is today. So, you've probably seen photos of the hotel before, haven't you?
Yes.
Right. And so, have you read up pretty well on what happened that day?
Yeah, I've done some research into the incident from the accounts that I can understand. The suspect had been taken into custody 2 days prior by Border Patrol. He was an Englishman, and he had traveled from Canada to the U.S. via train en route to Boston was his final destination. And for whatever reason, he was acting suspiciously, so when the train stopped at the customs port in Newport, Border Patrol had taken him into custody at that time. The details from there are a little foggy, but it appears as though while he was being detained, he was allowed to stay at the Newport house,
Right.
which was a hotel-type environment at the time. And 2 days later, Border Patrol decided that they were going to deport him back to Canada. So when he was given this information, he became unruly, and the two Border Patrol officers called for backup, and that's when Officer Montague responded.
Right.
So as one of the Border Patrol agents had gone back upstairs to retrieve a personal article from the suspect, Officer Montague engaged him in some conversation, advising that, he thought it would be proper for the gentleman to pay the bill to the hotel that he owed. And when he reached into his pocket to pull out the money to pay for the hotel, he also pulled out a gun. He shot the Border Patrol agent twice and shot Officer Montague twice. Officer Montague succumbed to his injuries at the scene, and the other officer was taken for medical care back to his residence.
Right. And I understand he made I can't remember the exact statement, but basically when he was shot, his last words were he knew he was, I think it was something like he knew he was a goner, grab him, and so that, they got the fella, but he ended up spending the killer ended up spending the rest of his life in an asylum. He was ruled, I believe he was ruled unfit to stand trial, and he spent his remaining years in an asylum for the insane. So how does, even though Newport's a relatively safe place, so when you think of an officer being killed in Newport, even 100 years ago, as the chief, what do you think?
I mean, I think it highlights just the dangers of this job. I think sometimes those that aren't in law enforcement might perceive the community that we are blessed to live in to be an environment where, quote unquote, that type of thing doesn't happen. And, be it today or 100 years ago, it's just a staunch reminder, at least to the officers at Newport, that this kind of thing can happen. It has happened, and we need to be vigilant in our tactics and our responses to even the what people would refer to as a routine type of call. I mean, Officer Montague was essentially going down to help an unruly customer at a hotel, and it turned into a fatal situation. So you don't ever know if that traffic stop at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, could be a wanted individual or someone that's, intent on harm to a police officer or the general public.
I think, I often wonder if you live in an area like this where, even your bad people are typically not that bad. But I wonder if it's harder for officers. I wonder if officers do let their guards down more than if you're living and working in a crime-ridden area. Just because, most of the people, you might get a lot of lip service from people, but for the most part, wouldn't you say most people are pretty decent?
Oh, absolutely. 99% of the general public that we deal with are extremely polite, extremely pro-police, very giving to the police department, whether it be through donations. I mean, around Christmas time, we're inundated with baked goods and cards and thank yous and well wishes. So the general public is, and that's what can be very difficult about this job, is that you always have to be on edge because you don't know who you're dealing with, and you hope that the encounter does go well. You hope the encounter is a positive interaction between law enforcement and the general public. But there are those occasions where it's not, and you have to be prepared for that.
Right, because you don't want another Joseph Montague.
That is, when I lay down at night, that's my biggest fear, is that we could potentially have something happen like that during my tenure. It would be not only devastating to the department, but devastating to the community as well. So that's certainly something that keeps me awake.
And so do you think that's why it's also important to, although, Mr. Montague, he had largely been, he'd largely been forgotten. Paul, Chief Duquette, was looking for a photo just for the department, and then I stumbled onto the newspaper clipping, and other than just, mostly us, he'd been largely forgotten. And do you think this is why it's important, even 100 years later, not to forget him?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anybody that puts the badge and the uniform on, recognizes that is a possibility, that you may have to give your life in the line of duty for the greater good of the society or the community that we serve. Right. And that's exactly what Officer Montague did. So I think it's important to remember his sacrifice to the community, and use it as a reminder to present day officers that this type of thing can happen in our community.
I'm going to read something that was in the paper at the time. It puts a little bit of human quality behind this photo. Very few men were or could be him in this respect. He was a great friend of children, and the children of him. When an officer wins over the respect of the children in young people, it might be said his duty is lessened in half. When the body of the officer was resting in the undertaking rooms, more than 60 children called out of respect for the officer, who was also their friend. What a noble tribute could be paid an officer than that, a tribute none of the rest of us will ever have the honor of receiving. Aged people also will miss him in his day duty. He could sight one the length of the street, and if the point was congested with traffic, was always hurried to their relief. Neither was he, the high or low, rich or poor, received the same reprimand if they disobeyed the rules of traffic. To be sure, he was a comparative stranger to our midst, but stranger or not, it is doubtful if favoritism was in his veins. This was to be his credit. His social ability was also to his credit. This, in few short months he was with us, won him many friends. 50 or more of our prominent citizens followed his remains to the train. His attention to duty, social ability, love for children, and respect for the aged, and placing all on the same level, together with no desire to punish, only where gross and willful negligence caused it, rendered him an officer of such prominent ability that his place will be hard to fill. So that really put some human qualities behind that photo. He seemed like he was truly beloved, and he liked people. Do you expect that of your officers today?
Yeah, I think that pretty much embodies just about any police officer that I know, but specifically the officers at Newport PD. I mean, our mission, our mission statement and core values at the police department are courtesy, professionalism, and respect. Right. And be it today or 100 years ago, clearly this officer embodied the same principles, whether they be in a formal mission statement and core values or not. What we're out there to do is we're out there to serve the public. We're out there to keep the public safe, and we're out there to be a resource to the community. Sometimes, as you said in the reading that you just did, rich or poor, everyone was treated the same. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of people out there that would normally have a high opinion of the police department, but could be upset at a specific traffic ticket they were given, or a civil issue that the police department may deal with. But I think it speaks volumes to have words like that of a Newport police officer 100 years ago, and then to look at where the department is today and the values that we embrace today, coinciding with one another.
Now, did you have the privilege of working with the late John Vinan?
I did.
When he passed, and I wrote about it, including on social media. I think John truly, those words could easily have been said about him, because when John passed and I wrote about it, everybody came out of the woodwork and just had stories to tell, including ended up on the wrong side.
Mm-hmm.
But how, because of the way, everybody, so many people had stories about, even if John arrested them, the impact that they said he had on their lives, because, yeah, he had a job to do, but he didn't let it go to his, he didn't let it go to his head, and he did make, he made a difference in so many lives. And he said that he even admitted some of the young officers came on, because you get out of the academy, you can solve the problems of the world.
Sure.
So you think. And he said some of the young guys looked at me and said, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. And so I had younger officers, including Chief Duquette. He said, when I first met John, he said he basically rolled his eyes and said, yeah, I'm out to solve the problems of the world, and you're playing grandfather.
Mm-hmm. And
he said, I quickly realized that John's way of policing was the right way of policing. So how did you feel about John when you met him?
Yeah, I remember very vividly the first shift that I worked with him. And, with age comes wisdom.
Yeah.
And John had been a police officer for many, many, many years, and he had learned many, many lessons. And I think he was able to learn from those lessons. And again, another prime example of an officer at Newport PD embodying that courtesy, professionalism, and respect. Yes, we have a job to do, but that doesn't mean that you should treat anyone differently than the way you want to be treated. Right. And so I think, the testimony and the words written about Officer Montague and the things that were said at Officer Vining's funeral, and the attitudes and opinions of the department today all kind of coincide to the fact that we're out there trying to serve the community. We're out there doing it as respectfully as possible, under difficult circumstances and difficult times when policing is not a very popular profession nationwide at this point in time. But I think it just speaks volumes of the men and women that serve at the Newport Police Department to go out day after day and to give 110% towards the community that they serve in the capacity that they do.
I know this is off the topic, but you mentioned it is, there really is an issue, the lack of respect for law enforcement, and sometimes it goes both ways. But how is Newport faring during these difficult times?
Yeah.
Do you have many people who you think totally disrespect you?
No, I think that's the very minority in this community, in this area. I think largely we have full support of the community. Right. And as I said earlier, those feelings and sentiments are seen throughout the year, specifically around holiday times. But to get letters from kids at schools and pictures drawn from kids at the elementary school, well wishes from community members, thank yous posted to Facebook or what have you, for the job that we do. That really puts a smile on officers' faces. I don't think the general public recognizes how much a simple thank you to a police officer, how far that goes.
So for you though, is it a two-way street? If you're hearing you're having maybe trouble with an officer,
mm-hmm.
You're hearing kind of the same thing about them not, the public being concerned. Do you look into it, or do you automatically take their word for it, or what do you do if you hear constant complaints about an officer? What do you do?
Yeah, initially what we'll do is the sergeants and I will sit down and we'll review the conduct of the officer on specifically the calls that we may have complaints about. But then we'll randomly pull some other interactions to see if we see like behavior in that officer. And then based on the totality of the circumstances, we'll decide if additional training or subsequent training is required, like de-escalation training or additional training in the area of dealing with victims or dealing with victims of with post-traumatic stress. I mean, those type of victims can be much more difficult to interview. So we have a very robust training program, and we try to embrace the idea that while we as police officers may see the conduct of an officer being okay, if we're going to get repeated complaints from the public about a specific officer, the way they're handling things, we recognize that there may be a training issue there, and we look to rectify that.
Yeah, because you really do have a challenging job, because you're dealing with, you're dealing with just the average person, but then you're dealing with people with mental illness, you're dealing with drugs, and so you're the whole gambit. And I have friends who have been long-term officers, and they will even tell me that you've got to be careful you don't become jaded. They said you can become jaded in the job just because you deal with so much of the negative, the negative that a lot of us don't understand.
Yeah. It's a very unique work environment that we live in.
Right.
And very, very rarely, if ever in my career, have I had someone call the police department and say, in fact, this has never happened, can you send an officer down here today because my family and I are getting along awesome, and we just want to see you guys, we want you guys to see how much we love each other and how much we get along.
Right.
That type of call does not come to the police department. We see almost every call in its worst, most violent, most chaotic episode, and day after day after day of dealing with those type of calls can start to wear on any individual, let alone a police officer. So that's where we try to use training and services through VLCT and EAP to be able to provide support to officers who may start to struggle with, what am I doing? I'm day in and day out, I'm dealing with the same people, and I don't seem to be making a difference, because it can really start to weigh on you after a while.
I've lived a pretty deprived life. This is what I tell people. I've been married for 32 years. I haven't had an affair. I haven't even had a speeding ticket. I've never had a mug shot. And, I guess I'm 52 years old, and it's not too late to start on some of these things. But no, I haven't had a speeding ticket. And, you might be able to take care of that later today. I don't know. But, no, I've lived a pretty deprived life. But I think, I kind of like this boring life, though.
Yeah, I think throughout time, again, with age comes wisdom.
Right.
And so those of us that have lived a life where we may have limited interaction with the police, right. I think even, at least in this community specifically, those people still recognize and appreciate the job that we do, so that they can live that type of life.
Okay, back to the ceremony you're having. Have you set up a time for the ceremony for Mr. Montague?
No, our plans are a little loose at this point. We're in the planning phases. We've met with Border Patrol and the head of their honor guard to discuss what assets are available and how a ceremony might look. We have a loose agenda planned, and but as far as nailing down times, event location is pretty set, but the time is not.
So is this going to be will you be making the public aware? Or
absolutely.
Is this going to be open to the public?
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, I know with the Border Patrol, Eric LaValle, he plays a pretty mean. I think is he the head of the honor guard? Or
yes, and he's the bugler.
Right. Yeah. He does a great job at that.
Yep.
So, and then you said there's going to be what following?
We're going to have a small reception following.
Where's that going to be?
We're not 100% sure yet. It may be at the fire station, maybe right there at the municipal offices. It's kind of weather dependent as well, so we want to make sure that we have a backup plan available if the weather's foul.
Right. So this is going to be what, a half hour probably?
Yeah, depending on. I kind of want to get some of the ideas from family, if the family are going to be present, what it is that they'd like to see.
Right.
But because we're not going to have a large portion of like seating available and things. We're trying to keep the ceremony somewhat short. So if there are people from the public that want to come out, it'll be standing room.
Right. And I've given you the contact information for the great-grandson, and I'm sure he'll pass it around. Once you contact him,
Yes.
I'm sure he'll pass it around. I wouldn't be surprised if his name is Bridge Kearney, the great-grandson. I wouldn't be surprised if he might come on over because, as I said, I met with them. Well, actually, here's a photo of them right here. This is during their visit to Newport, and at that point they were looking at the very site where their ancestor was killed. And here's a photo. The older lady in it is the widow of the fallen officer, and the other ones are her family. So he left behind that. Mr. Montague left behind children, and so they grew up. Well, the family. I don't believe the wife ever remarried. So it was a life-changing experience it wasn't just him losing his life. It was the entire family. It reshaped their lives for generations.
Sure.
So.
Absolutely, and the effects on the community. I mean, if you read those newspaper articles and the articles that you've written about the aftermath and what the community felt about it, that can really shake a community. So,
okay. But all bad said and done, the officer did die. But I think it says something about Newport that it's been 100 years and no other officer has died.
Yeah, I think that's it's definitely a testament to not only the training regiments and the vigor of the officers that work at Newport Police Department, but I think it stands to the larger call of the Vermont Police Academy and how they teach officers to be vigilant and to stay aware, and the ongoing training and the leadership that Paul Duquette had provided prior to my tenure. Those type of things all coming together are what I feel very blessed to be able to work at a department that I do.
And with John Vinen, when I interviewed him when he retired, and some other officers I've interviewed, they said that officers, though, have the ability to de-escalate situations with just words often, or you can escalate them for no good reason so it's it isn't just because if you go in here, like I think somebody once told me, if you go into a situation where like a bull in a china shop, you could just make things a whole lot worse.
Absolutely.
So, and John Vinen, he was honest. He said, Scott, I have a gift for gab.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, but I can't beat my way out of a wet paper bag. He says, I cannot fight. And he says, my gift for talk, he said, always served me extremely well. And, maybe other people it wouldn't have, but he did have that gift.
Yeah. That's part of the training that we go through is verbal de-escalation, and even things, as small as like what the public would refer to as our use of force continuum. We call it the response to active resistance continuum. The very first portion of that is simply presence.
Right.
That is, in fact, a show of force, and sometimes that's all it takes is an officer showing up in uniform, and that will help to de-escalate the situation. Many times it doesn't, and that's where the verbal skills that we try to teach come into play, to be able to get to a resolution for that incident without having to go hands-on with someone.
Okay, well, we've just about used up our time, and I just thank you for remembering the fallen officer. 100 years, and he still hasn't been forgotten.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity.
Right, and I'm sure the public will be following when the event is actually being held. Was September 26th on the 100th anniversary of his death, but you'll be getting out more of the details.
Yes.
Okay, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Scott.
And thank you to the viewers for tuning in to another segment of the Northeast Kingdom Voice.